Case 1, 1983, Oklahoma. 15-year-old William Wayne Thompson was charged with the murder of his former brother-in-law, an accusation that immediately placed the case beyond a routine homicide investigation. The charge raised questions not only about the crime itself, but about whether a juvenile could face the most severe punishment available under state law. According to investigators, the first signs of trouble appeared after a family dispute escalated and contact with the victim abruptly stopped. Within days, attention turned toward Thompson, setting the stage for a legal battle that would reach the highest court in the country. The case formally began when Charles Keene was reported missing by family members in Oklahoma in early 1983. Keene had last been seen leaving his residence after a domestic disagreement involving relatives connected to Thompson. Local authorities initiated a missing person inquiry and quickly expanded the search as inconsistencies emerged in witness accounts. Within a short period, investigators located Keene's body in a rural area, confirming he had been killed by gunshot wounds. Evidence collected at the scene suggested an attempt had been made to conceal the body. As the timeline was reconstructed, details surrounding Thompson's movements began to draw scrutiny, but the physical evidence did not align with initial assumptions made during the search. Charles Keene was an adult male with established family ties to William Wayne Thompson through marriage, placing both men in regular contact prior to the crime. Keene maintained a routine that included frequent interaction with extended family members, which made his sudden disappearance immediately noticeable. Records showed ongoing tension between Keene and Thompson, stemming from personal disputes that had intensified in the weeks before the killing. Friends and relatives later confirmed the relationship had deteriorated significantly. This strained connection placed Thompson within close proximity to Keene during the critical time frame. What initially appeared to be a private family matter soon escalated into a criminal investigation. It would take only days for their quiet family life to unravel completely. Investigators focused on reconstructing Keene's final movements, using physical evidence recovered from the scene and surrounding areas. Forensic examination confirmed the cause of death as gunshot wounds, and additional findings indicated deliberate efforts to move and hide the body. Authorities traced vehicle activity and reviewed witness statements that placed Thompson near the location during the relevant period. Items recovered during searches supported the developing theory of Thompson's involvement. Investigators also documented admissions attributed to Thompson during questioning, which were entered into the case file. As the evidence accumulated, the narrative of the crime became clearer. Then, a single confirmed detail shifted the investigation from suspicion to formal accusation. William Wayne Thompson was taken into custody at the age of 15 and charged with murder under Oklahoma law. Prosecutors elected to try Thompson as an adult, citing the severity of the offense and the supporting evidence gathered during the investigation. Court records showed that the proceedings moved quickly through the pretrial stages, with motions focusing primarily on jurisdiction and sentencing authority. Thompson was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death, a decision that drew immediate attention due to his age. The ruling placed Oklahoma among states willing to impose capital punishment on juvenile offenders. When confronted with the full weight of the evidence, the case moved from criminal court into constitutional territory. Following the sentencing, Thompson's case was appealed through the state court system and eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. In Thompson v. Oklahoma, the court examined whether executing an individual for a crime committed under the age of 16 violated the Constitution. The justices ruled that such executions were unconstitutional, overturning Thompson's death sentence. The decision established a national precedent restricting capital punishment for juvenile offenders. Thompson's sentence was vacated, and the ruling reshaped how states approached juvenile sentencing in capital cases. While the legal question was resolved, debate continued over accountability and punishment. To this day, the case remains a landmark in juvenile justice jurisprudence. Case 2. 1975, San Angelo, Texas. 17-year-old Charles Francis Rumball carried out a robbery that ended in homicide and a capital murder prosecution. The crime unfolded inside a small local jewelry store and immediately drew attention because of its apparent randomness and violence. According to investigators, the incident escalated within minutes of Rumball entering the store. The victim was fatally shot during a physical STR. Leaving little uncertainty that a serious felony had occurred. Within days, authorities focused on Rumball, whose age would later become a central issue as the case moved toward a death sentence under Texas law. The case began on an afternoon in 1975 when Charles Rumball entered a jewelry store in San Angelo, Texas. The business was owned and operated by Michael Fiorillo, who was alone inside at the time. Investigators later confirmed that Rumball attempted to rob the store, prompting a confrontation between the two men. During the struggle, Fiorillo was shot and collapsed inside the shop. Emergency services were notified, but Fiorillo was pronounced dead at the scene. Police secured the location and recovered physical evidence consistent with a robbery gone wrong. The initial narrative focused on a spontaneous act of violence, but further examination raised questions about intent and responsibility. Michael Fiorillo was a well-known local jeweler who had operated his business in San Angelo for years. He followed a predictable daily routine and was regarded as a stable presence in the community's commercial district. Fiorillo had no prior connection to Charles Rumball, and the crime appeared to be opportunistic rather than personal. News of his death spread quickly, prompting strong public reaction and calls for accountability. Community members expressed concern over violent crime entering a familiar setting. The lack of any prior relationship between victim and suspect simplified the narrative for prosecutors. The focus shifted rapidly from grief to punishment. Investigators relied on eyewitness accounts from nearby businesses and individuals who observed Rumball before and after the robbery. Authorities documented Rumball's movements following the shooting, including behavior that suggested an attempt to flee responsibility. Physical evidence recovered from the store was consistent with witness descriptions of the struggle. Law enforcement reconstructed the sequence of events and concluded that the killing occurred during the commission of a robbery, meeting the criteria for capital murder under Texas law. Prosecutors emphasized the felony component of the crime. As the evidence was compiled, the path toward a capital charge became increasingly clear. Charles Rumball was arrested and formally charged with capital murder. Despite being 17 years old at the time of the offense, prosecutors pursued the death penalty under existing Texas statutes. The case proceeded to trial, where the jury reviewed evidence supporting the robbery and homicide charges. Rumball was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Court records reflected little dispute over the facts of the crime, with arguments focusing instead on punishment. The sentence placed Rumball among a small group of juvenile offenders facing execution. The conviction moved swiftly into the appeals phase. After exhausting available appeals, Charles Francis Rumball remained on death row throughout the early 1980s. Legal challenges did not result in a reversal or sentence reduction. In 1985, the state of Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. Rumball became one of the first individuals executed for a crime committed as a juvenile after capital punishment resumed in the United States. The execution drew attention from legal observers monitoring juvenile sentencing practices. While the case concluded procedurally, it continued to be cited in discussions surrounding the death penalty and age. The broader implications remained unresolved in public debate. Case 3. 1946, Louisiana. 15-year-old Willie Francis was sentenced to die in the electric chair for murder, making him one of the youngest individuals to face execution in the United States. The conviction occurred in a deeply segregated legal system, where outcomes were often shaped by race and limited legal protections. Francis, a black teenager, stood accused of killing a white man, a charge that immediately drew intense attention from authorities. According to court records, the case moved rapidly from arrest to conviction. Within months, Francis was placed on death row, setting the stage for a legal controversy that would later reach the Supreme Court. The case began with the death of Andrew Thomas, a white pharmacist found shot outside his workplace in St. Martinville, Louisiana, in 1944. Willie Francis was taken into custody shortly afterward and questioned by local law enforcement. During interrogation, Francis signed a confession that later became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys argued that the confession was coerced, obtained under pressure, and without adequate legal representation. Despite these claims, the confession was admitted into evidence. The trial proceeded in a racially charged courtroom environment, and Francis was convicted of murder. But the circumstances surrounding the confession raised serious constitutional concerns. Andrew Thomas was a local pharmacist whose business placed him in regular contact with residents of the community. His death was treated as a serious offense that demanded swift resolution. As a white victim in the segregated South, Thomas's killing triggered public outrage and immediate demands for justice. Willie Francis, a black teenager with limited education and no criminal record, was quickly identified as the suspect. There was no documented personal relationship between Francis and Thomas. The social context of the era shaped both public perception and legal proceedings. The imbalance of power between the accused and the state became evident early in the process. The investigation relied primarily on Francis's interrogation statements rather than extensive physical evidence. Law enforcement record showed little forensic analysis connecting Francis directly to the shooting. Defense resources were minimal, and Francis's legal counsel lacked the capacity to challenge the prosecution effectively. No comprehensive review of alternative suspects was documented. The confession remained the central piece of evidence presented at trial. Concerns over due process were raised but not addressed by the trial court. As the case advanced toward sentencing, the reliability of the investigation remained largely unexamined. In 1946, Willie Francis was scheduled for execution by electric chair at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. During the execution attempt, the electric chair malfunctioned, and Francis survived the procedure. Prison officials halted the execution after determining the equipment had been improperly set up. Francis was returned to his cell, alive, after the failed attempt. His attorneys appealed, arguing that a second execution would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. The case was brought before the United States Supreme Court. The failed execution transformed the case from a state matter into a national constitutional issue. In 1947, the Supreme Court ruled that a second execution attempt did not violate the Constitution. The court determined that the initial failure was an accident rather than intentional punishment. Following the ruling, Louisiana scheduled a new execution date. Willie Francis was again placed in the electric chair and executed later that year. The decision marked one of the most controversial rulings involving capital punishment and juveniles. Francis's case became a lasting reference in legal discussions about due process and the death penalty. The outcome remains a point of debate in American legal history. Case 4, 1979, Amarillo, Texas. 17-year-old J. Kelly Pinkerton committed a series of violent crimes that escalated into multiple rape murders during residential burglaries. The attacks occurred within a short time frame and followed a consistent pattern, drawing immediate concern from local authorities. Investigators later confirmed that the suspect targeted women living alone, entering their homes during nighttime hours. The brutality of the offenses quickly distinguished the case from routine burglary investigations. As evidence accumulated, attention centered on Pinkerton, whose age became a secondary issue as the scope and severity of the crimes came into focus. The case began when Pinkerton broke into an apartment in Amarillo, occupied by college student Sarah Dawn Lawrence. According to police reports, the intrusion occurred during nighttime hours, catching the victim off guard. Lawrence was sexually assaulted and then murdered inside her residence. The crime scene showed signs of forced entry and a violent struggle. Emergency responders were called after Lawrence failed to appear for scheduled commitments, leading to the discovery of her body. Investigators secured the apartment and documented evidence consistent with both burglary and homicide. The nature of the crime suggested it was not an isolated incident. As investigators expanded their inquiry, they identified a second victim, Sher Butler, who had been killed under similar circumstances. Butler's death occurred during another residential break-in, following a pattern that closely mirrored the Lawrence case. Both victims were young women attacked in their homes, and both crimes involved sexual assault followed by murder. The similarities between the two scenes prompted authorities to link the cases. The killings intensified fear within the community and increased pressure on law enforcement to identify the perpetrator. With two victims connected by method and timing, the investigation shifted toward locating a serial offender. Law enforcement collected physical evidence from both crime scenes, including forensic material that suggested the same individual was responsible. Investigators also obtained statements that placed J. Kelly Pinkerton near the locations during the relevant time periods. Additional evidence recovered during searches further connected Pinkerton to the offenses. Authorities reconstrued the timeline of the burglaries and attacks, noting consistent behavior patterns. As the case developed, prosecutors determined that the evidence supported charges of capital murder. The connection between the two crimes became central to building the case against Pinkerton. J. Kelly Pinkerton was arrested and charged in connection with both murders. Prosecutors elected to try the cases separately, presenting evidence specific to each victim. In both trials, juries convicted Pinkerton of capital murder. Despite his age at the time of the offenses, he was sentenced to death for each conviction under Texas law. Court records reflected that the sentences were based on the severity and repetitive nature of the crimes. Pinkerton was placed on death row following the convictions. The case moved forward with limited focus on mitigation. Pinkerton remained incarcerated on death row as appeals were processed through the courts. Legal challenges did not result in reversal or sentence modification. In 1986, the state of Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. Pinkerton was 24 years old at the time of his death. His execution marked the conclusion of one of Texas's most severe juvenile capital cases. The case continued to be referenced in discussions surrounding capital punishment for crimes committed by minors. The legal outcome closed the proceedings, but left broader policy questions unresolved. Case 5. 1977, Louisiana. 17-year-old Dalton Prejean, a juvenile with documented intellectual disabilities, killed a state trooper during a roadside encounter. The incident immediately elevated the case beyond a routine criminal matter due to the status of the victim and the age of the suspect. Authorities treated the killing as a direct attack on law enforcement. According to official records, the crime occurred without prolonged warning and ended within moments. Prejean was taken into custody shortly afterward, and prosecutors moved quickly to pursue capital charges. From the outset, the case drew national attention over whether a cognitively impaired minor could face execution. The case began during a traffic stop conducted by Louisiana State Trooper Donald Cleveland in 1977. Prejean was a passenger in the vehicle when the stop occurred. As Trooper Cleveland stood behind the car completing the stop, Prejean exited the vehicle and fired a weapon, striking the trooper from behind. Cleveland collapsed at the scene and later died from his injuries. Emergency responders were dispatched, but life-saving efforts were unsuccessful. Law enforcement secured the area and initiated an immediate manhunt. The circumstances of the shooting left little dispute about the sequence of events, but questions remained about intent and capacity. Trooper Donald Cleveland was a respected member of the Louisiana State Police with an established service record. His death was treated as a significant loss within the law enforcement community. Public response was swift, with widespread calls for accountability and severe punishment. The killing of a uniformed officer during a traffic stop intensified pressure on prosecutors and elected officials. Dalton Prejean, by contrast, had a history of cognitive limitations and a troubled background. The disparity between victim and suspect became a central feature of the case. The public narrative focused largely on retribution rather than rehabilitation. Investigators compiled evidence that included eyewitness accounts from the traffic stop and surrounding area. Law enforcement documented Prejean's prior criminal history, which was introduced as part of the case file. Ballistics evidence confirmed that the fatal shot came from the weapon in Prejean's possession. Psychological evaluations conducted later indicated significant intellectual impairment. Despite this, the prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the act. The investigation established a clear timeline and chain of custody for the evidence. As the case advanced, the focus shifted from guilt to punishment. Dalton Prejean was formally charged with capital murder and brought to trial. During sentencing, defense attorneys presented mitigation evidence related to his intellectual disabilities and developmental limitations. The jury, composed entirely of white jurors, rejected these arguments. Prejean was sentenced to death under Louisiana law. The verdict drew criticism from legal observers and human rights organizations. Appeals were filed citing mental capacity and juvenile status. Despite these efforts, the sentence remained in place as the case moved through the appellate system. In 1990, after years on death row, Dalton Prejean was executed by the state of Louisiana. His execution proceeded despite international appeals for clemency and intervention. Advocacy groups cited his age at the time of the offense and his intellectual impairments as grounds for mercy. Courts declined to halt the execution. Prejean's death marked knee of the final juvenile executions carried out in the United States. The case remains referenced in discussions surrounding the death penalty, intellectual disability, and juvenile justice. The broader ethical questions continue to be debated. Case 6. 1977, South Carolina. 17-year-old James Terry Roach became involved in a horrific crime that ended in the deaths of two teenagers. The incident shocked the local community and drew attention to the role of juveniles in violent crime. Roach's age immediately raised questions about the appropriateness of the ultimate punishment. Authorities treated the case as a high-profile double homicide, and it became a focal point for debates on juvenile justice and capital punishment in the state. The combination of youth and brutality ensured widespread media coverage and public scrutiny throughout the investigation and trial process. The case began when Roach, along with accomplices, kidnapped two teenage victims in 1977. During the abduction, the situation escalated violently, resulting in the victims being killed. Law enforcement received reports of missing persons shortly after the incident, and a search led authorities to the discovery of the victims' bodies. Forensic evidence and witness statements linked Roach and his accomplices to the crime scene. The violent circumstances and premeditated nature of the killings intensified the urgency of the investigation. The state quickly moved to secure confessions and corroborating evidence to support criminal charges. The victims were minors, both teenagers, whose deaths deeply impacted their families and the broader community. Their age heightened the public's outrage and contributed to calls for the maximum penalty. The brutality of the murders drew attention to the vulnerabilities of youth and the consequences of violent behavior. Media coverage emphasized the loss of young lives and portrayed the victims as innocent, increasing societal demand for accountability. The nature of the victims, relationship to the community, and the manner of their deaths played a central role in framing the case for prosecution. Investigators collected substantial evidence connecting Roach to the double murder. Physical evidence at the crime scene, combined with eyewitness statements and the testimony of accomplices, established his participation. Forensic analysis corroborated timelines and actions attributed to Roach. Despite some questions regarding his intellectual limitations, the evidence presented a compelling case of direct involvement. Law enforcement meticulously documented each step, ensuring a clear narrative linking Roach to the murders, which would later support the capital murder charges in court. James Terry Roach was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder. During the trial, defense attorneys highlighted his limited intellectual capacity and argued for mitigation. Prosecutors, however, emphasized the severity of the crimes and the premeditated nature of the actions. The jury ultimately sentenced Roach to death. Appeals citing his age and cognitive limitations were filed, but were unsuccessful in overturning the sentence. The case drew attention from legal scholars and advocacy groups concerned with juvenile executions. In 1986, after clemency appeals were denied, James Terry Roach was executed by electric chair in South Carolina. The execution proceeded despite controversy surrounding his intellectual abilities and age at the time of the offense. Human rights organizations and legal observers criticized the decision, citing ethical concerns about executing juveniles with cognitive limitations. Roach's case remains a notable example in discussions about capital punishment for juveniles, highlighting the ongoing tension between legal retribution and considerations of age and mental capacity. Case 7, 1987, Oklahoma. 17-year-old Scott Allen Hain became involved in a violent carjacking that ended in a double murder. The brutality of the crime and Hain's age sparked debates over juvenile capital punishment. The incident gained national attention due to the shocking nature of the killings and the legal questions surrounding the death penalty for minors. Hain's youth contrasted sharply with the severity of the offense, raising ethical and constitutional concerns. Public outrage and media coverage intensified the focus on his case, ensuring it would be scrutinized at both state and federal levels throughout the legal process. The case unfolded when Hain and an accomplice targeted a vehicle during a robbery. The victims were forcibly confined to the trunk of their car, and the perpetrators set the vehicle on fire. Investigators determined that both victims had died from burns and smoke inhalation. Law enforcement quickly linked the crime to Hain through physical evidence, witness accounts, and the recovery of items connected to the stolen vehicle. The violent and premeditated nature of the act highlighted the calculated aspect of the crime, prompting prosecutors to pursue the death penalty despite Hain's age. The victims, Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders, were found to have died from severe burns and smoke inhalation, making the crime particularly horrific. Their deaths devastated their families and shocked the community. The circumstances of the murders, being locked in a trunk and burned alive, added to the public's outrage. Both victims were ordinary citizens whose lives were tragically cut short, and the nature of their deaths intensified calls for justice and reinforced the prosecution's pursuit of the death penalty. Investigators gathered evidence linking Hain and his accomplice to the crime. Items recovered from the vehicle, physical evidence at the scene, and statements from witnesses corroborated Hain's direct involvement. Forensic analysis confirmed that the victims had been confined in the trunk and that the fire was intentionally set. The investigative process firmly established a timeline and method of the crime, creating a strong foundation for the capital murder charges. Authorities emphasized the premeditation and cruelty involved, solidifying the case for Hain's prosecution. Scott Allen Hain was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder. The initial sentencing resulted in the death penalty, but legal challenges led to a second penalty phase, reaffirming his death sentence. The trial included arguments about his age and potential for rehabilitation, but the jury ultimately upheld the maximum sentence. Appeals and interventions by advocacy groups highlighted the ethical debate over executing juveniles, yet the courts maintained the conviction and sentence, citing the severity and deliberate nature of the crime. In 2003, Scott Allen Hain was executed in Oklahoma, becoming the last juvenile offender to be executed in the United States. His case remains a landmark in discussions on juvenile capital punishment, highlighting both the legal limits of the death penalty for minors and the moral controversies surrounding such executions. The execution concluded a long legal battle and sparked ongoing debates about the balance between retribution and the rights of juvenile offenders in the American justice system. Case 8. 1985, Oklahoma. 16-year-old Sean Sellers carried out a series of violent murders that shocked his community and drew national attention. Initially involved in criminal activity, Sellers' actions escalated to murder, challenging legal and moral boundaries regarding juvenile offenders. The brutality of his crimes and his young age prompted debates about the appropriateness of the death penalty for minors. Media coverage highlighted both the gruesome nature of the murders and the emerging discussion over whether juveniles could be held fully accountable under capital punishment statutes. Sellers' case became a focal point in the ongoing conversation about juvenile justice and the limits of legal retribution. The case began when Sellers shot a convenience store clerk during a robbery. The violent act demonstrated a willingness to use lethal force for personal gain, immediately drawing police attention. Evidence collected at the scene, including eyewitness accounts and physical traces, helped establish Sellers' involvement. This initial murder marked the start of a pattern of escalating violence, revealing both premeditation and a troubling disregard for human life. The robbery and shooting set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in additional, more personal killings. The victims included the convenience store clerk and, later, Sellers' own parents. The murders of his parents occurred while they were asleep, intensifying the horror of his actions. Their deaths devastated the family and the local community, highlighting the personal betrayal involved and the extreme nature of the crimes. The combination of a public victim and close family members amplified the societal impact and reinforced the perception of Sellers as a uniquely dangerous offender. Investigators connected Sellers to all three murders through ballistics evidence and his own confessions. Forensic analysis of the firearm linked him to the convenience store shooting, while his admissions detailed the killings of his parents. Law enforcement compiled physical and testimonial evidence that corroborated his confessions, solidifying the case for prosecution. The clear link between Sellers and the crimes removed reasonable doubt and allowed authorities to pursue capital charges. Sean Sellers was arrested, tried, and convicted for the murders. Despite being only 16 at the time of the offenses, he was sentenced to death. The trial included discussions of his age, background, and psychological state, but the court determined the severity and calculated nature of the killings warranted the maximum penalty. Appeals citing his juvenile status and potential for rehabilitation were unsuccessful, and his sentence was upheld through the legal process. In 1999, Sean Sellers was executed in Oklahoma. His execution generated international criticism and fueled debates over the morality and legality of executing juvenile offenders. Sellers' case remains one of the most controversial juvenile death penalty cases in U.S. history, underscoring the tension between public demand for justice and the ethical questions surrounding the execution of minors. Case 9. 1984, San Antonio. 17-year-old Ruben Cantu was accused of a crime that would lead to his execution, capturing national attention. Charged with the murder of a police officer during a robbery, his case highlighted tensions between juvenile accountability and capital punishment. The combination of his youth and the serious nature of the crime raised questions about fairness in the legal system. Public opinion was heavily influenced by the fact that a law enforcement officer was the victim, intensifying calls for justice. Cantu's case later became a symbol of the risks of wrongful conviction in capital cases, sparking ongoing debate about the death penalty for minors. The case began when Officer Joe De La Rosa was shot during an attempted robbery. Witnesses reported seeing a suspect at the scene, and initial police work quickly focused on Cantu. Evidence was largely circumstantial, with eyewitness accounts forming the backbone of the prosecution's case. The shooting of a police officer elevated the urgency of the investigation and placed significant pressure on law enforcement to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. The incident triggered a swift legal response, setting the stage for a high-profile trial. Officer Joe De La Rosa, a respected member of the San Antonio police force, was the sole victim. His status as a law enforcement officer heightened public outrage and ensured intense media scrutiny. The loss of a police officer underscored the perceived threat posed by Cantu and amplified the case's gravity. The combination of a violent act and a high-profile victim fueled widespread support for the death penalty, leaving little room for leniency despite Cantu's age. Investigators relied heavily on eyewitness testimony to connect Cantu to the shooting. Physical evidence was limited, making the credibility of witnesses central to the prosecution's case. Some statements were later questioned for accuracy, raising concerns about the reliability of the identification process. At the time, the court accepted the testimonies as sufficient for conviction, illustrating both the strength and limitations of eyewitness-based investigations in capital cases. Ruben Cantu was arrested, tried as an adult, and convicted of capital murder. At 17, he faced the harshest penalty available under Texas law. The trial proceeded with limited consideration of his youth or potential mitigating circumstances. Cantu was sentenced to death, reflecting the combination of legal precedent and public pressure to impose the maximum penalty for the killing of a police officer. He was executed in 1993, but posthumous doubts about his guilt soon emerged. Investigations and interviews conducted after his death raised questions about the accuracy of eyewitness accounts and the strength of the evidence. Cantu's case became a focal point in debates over wrongful convictions and the ethics of executing juvenile offenders, illustrating the potentially irreversible consequences of flaws in the justice system. Case 10, 1964, Mississippi. 17-year-old Leonard Shockley killed a man during a robbery, shocking the local community. The violent act highlighted tensions over juvenile crime and capital punishment. Shockley's age drew attention to the ethical implications of executing minors, raising questions about culpability and justice. The crime occurred during a seemingly ordinary criminal act but escalated to murder, making it a high-profile case for authorities. Public sentiment demanded swift action, and the combination of a youth offender and a deadly crime intensified scrutiny on the state's legal system. The case began when Shockley shot a service station attendant during a robbery. Witnesses and initial reports described the crime as sudden and violent, immediately linking Shockley to the scene. Law enforcement rapidly gathered statements and evidence to identify the perpetrator. The incident set in motion a fast-moving investigation that emphasized both the severity of the offense and the age of the offender, creating a complex legal scenario for prosecutors. The victim was a civilian service station attendant, an ordinary worker whose death shocked the small community. His murder during a routine day at work provoked outrage and a strong demand for justice. The victim's status as a civilian intensified public pressure on the authorities to act decisively, framing the case as one demanding the harshest penalties under Mississippi law. Investigators collected physical evidence, including firearm analysis and ballistic data, which implicated Shockley in the killing. He also made admissions that reinforced the capital charge. The combination of tangible evidence and confessions ensured a strong case for the prosecution, leaving little room for doubt about Shockley's involvement. Shockley was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder. At just 17, he faced adult legal proceedings and received the death sentence. The trial was swift, reflecting both the urgency of the prosecution and the prevailing legal attitudes toward juvenile offenders committing serious crimes. Shockley's youth did not mitigate the severity of the sentence. He was executed in 1965, becoming one of the earliest juveniles put to death in the modern era of capital punishment. The case highlighted the controversial practice of executing minors and set a precedent that would later influence debates over juvenile sentencing in the United States.